if there was one ingredient to the Eric Johnson tone that I've sort of concluded now is really quite crucial, I'd say probably it's the tube driver. Now, these come in all kinds of different versions and all sorts of stuff like that. You know, you might want to go back and get an original version. You might look for a grey knob version. There's a whole thing. And not only that, but you've got to then think about which tube are you going to put in there. I think it's a Yugoslavian real tube that Eric would have, or specifically uses, apparently. But this has kind of taught me some other things about this idea of kind of searching for someone else's tone, because it is really kind of an endless rabbit hole. And I don't know what you think about how I've ended up with this tone here, but let's talk about it. This channel is supported by TrueFire. TrueFire is an online library of lessons from some of my favourite players. There's thousands of lessons on there. You can use the promo code JNC40 to get 40% off of any of their courses. My buddy Tony from up the road, this is his Fender not custom shop, is it? Fender Eric Johnson signature. However, some of the stuff is not standard on here. So like the saddles, he's replaced with these locking thingamajigs. I think he's replaced the tone pots and the volume pot. I think the volume pot is now a 500k PRS, and these are bare knuckle pots. This is a Creamery P90 style pickup, just in a Strat shape, and it has stainless steel frets now as well. I'm going to do another video on this guitar specifically because it's just aging like fine wine. But anyway, that's kind of the guitar part of it settled. Because there's this path in the neck, I didn't do the thing of rolling off the tone here. I felt like it was kind of a dark enough tone as it was. The tube driver, which I'll go into a little bit how I'm running it here. So how I ended up running it was that I've got the tube drive turned up quite high because I think the tube that Eric uses is a little bit higher gain than this one. I'm running the EQ like Eric, and the output level I've seen in some kind of clips or some shots that he sometimes runs this lower than unity gain essentially. And what he's doing, and Nick from That Pedal Show was kind of showing this on the Deluxe Reverb video, this idea that you can set your amp really high and crank it, but you don't always have to be at unity gain or above. You can go under, and they call it underdriving. Maybe something we should look at a bit more, because I think certainly it's not something that I've ever really tried. I guess the context that this would work more would be in a context like Eric Johnson, where you're in a situation where you're switching between a clean and dirty rig. In a normal context with an amplifier, for your lead tone to be at a lower volume essentially than your main rhythm tone wouldn't make a lot of sense. So I guess that's why maybe we don't really consider it that much. Like, I want more gain but less volume. Switching in and out of that doesn't make too much sense. The actual amp part of it is as close as I've got to a Marshall. So this is the Headfirst Dirty Shirley kind of clone, which is kind of like a Friedman take on a JTM 45. So you're going to imagine not too far away from a Plexi. How I ended up running it was with the gain and volume kind of... What have I got going on here? I've got the bass, mids and treble lower than 5 and the presence at about 2. You know, Eric does talk about experimenting with that sort of stuff. He says in the True Fire Eric Johnson video where he's talking about his tone and stuff, that he tends to run the bass, middle and treble lower and the volume and gain higher, is basically the way that he worded it. So I think there is room for movement within your amp dials as well. And then I ended up running the gain on the amp quite high and the volume a little bit lower. I've experimented with, you know, switching that around, running the gain on the amp lower and the volume higher, so you're getting more of the power amp kind of thing going on. But that is essentially, over the years, I think, been enough of the kind of key elements of Eric Johnson's tone that I thought, well, this hopefully will make me sound a little bit like Eric, right? So just checking in here, I think, hopefully. What we could do is turn up the volume here on the amp. I don't know how loud this is going to get, and then what it seems like Eric does somewhat is kind of underdrives with his tube driver. So without the tube driver, it's not as easy to play as I might personally like. It's quite a stiff kind of feel to it, like, and you have to just like a... play at this volume, but and I think it gets you kind of there. And then I got a message from Paul Bradshaw in the DMs on Instagram, and he said you should check out the Echoplex kind of pedals. And so this is another part of the Eric Johnson tone where in front of even the tube driver, he's running another gain stage of the Maestro Echoplex. And you can get solid state versions of those. And you think, well, this is just now becoming like an endless slope. And what I really stopped to think was, do I actually enjoy playing this tone as much as something that suits me better? And to me, like, this is a little bit less gain than I would normally use. It's a bit darker than I would normally go as well, a bit fluffier. And even though my initial tones kind of were aiming in that Eric Johnson territory, I think I've started to divert and found, you know, maybe something a bit glassier works better for me. and maybe something, you know, a bit squishier and not as fluffy and less fuzzy maybe works better for me. And I think this is probably true of quite a lot of folks. Like, you think about Joe Bonamassa has definitely been very vocal about Eric Johnson being a huge inspiration for him. Andy Timmons as well, I think, has talked about this as well to some extent. And that basically you can start your journey trying to replicate someone else's kind of tone, touch, rig and all that stuff. But hopefully somewhere along the way you kind of fall off of that path and you find the things that work for you. And the things that seem to work for me personally, I don't know if this is similar for you guys, actually don't include a lot of the Eric Johnson actual things anymore. So, you know, like a tube driver wouldn't be on my board. Something like a Marshall Governor would, or Blues Driver would. You know, an actual Marshall amplifier, gigging that, I've tried gigging this one once before. I found it a bit too scooped. And starting with a driven amp as a bass tone for a lead tone hasn't particularly worked for me live these days either. For me, I'm kind of a bit happier with the idea of just having a bass kind of Fender amplifier, you know, like Pro Reverb, Deluxe Reverb, something like that, and building the lead tones around that. I think that's super common these days. I think the idea of having a rig where you're switching between a clean amp like Fender, dirty amp Marshall, I think that is a little bit antiquated in some regards. And then you see even Eric Johnson himself now has moved on to being in a stage where he's even got a Tone Master Pro on stage, if you could believe it. And I had a Patreon member, Jeffrey, he was at this Eric Johnson gig, and Eric Johnson recently has been talking about doing a blues album just plugging straight into the front of a Marshall amplifier. And you think that's like a cool sounding thing, and then on the gig he's got his normal rig and also a Fender Tone Master Pro on the floor. I asked Jeff if he's actually recorded any of the tones from the Tone Master. Like, is there any recordings out there of Eric Johnson playing through that? I'd be really interested to see whether it sounds, you know, worse, better, or anything. Because for me, there's a specific Eric Johnson era that I think is the pinnacle of his tone, the Venus Isle era. And this stuff kind of gets you somewhere in the ballpark, like I can get with a modeler. But there's some secret magic missing. And I don't even think when I see like Eric Johnson playing anymore, it doesn't sound to me like the Venus Isle era stuff. I don't know if that's the same for you guys, but there's, you know, whether it's the RV and Musicom, Venus Isle, whichever albums you like best from Eric Johnson, there seems to me to always be, you know, like this golden era of stuff, and it's not necessarily possible to even get back there. I think Andy Wood owns an Eric Johnson Plexi, and that seems to get him very close to it, even though on his board as well, he's got kind of his own way of getting that Eric Johnson thing. But yeah, it's just taught me, I guess, that it's okay to try and get similar results with different gear, and you might even stumble across something that you like way better. You know, like a tube driver is not necessarily going to be something that I go out and buy ever. I borrowed it off my buddy Jake. A real Marshall Plexi, as much as I'd love to make a video and play one for a bit, is not something that I don't think ever going to realistically use. I could use this sort of thing because it's got a master volume, and I really love some of the tones of this. Not for the Eric Johnson side of things actually, but for more the glassy kind of edge of breakup tones rather than the full-on roaring kind of mid-heavy tones. You get this idea of searching for tones that are on albums, and maybe the components we can have there, we can learn some of these guys' licks, but potentially, hopefully, you kind of migrate off of that path and you start to figure out for yourself some bits and pieces that kind of work for you. And I think that's where I'm at now, maybe. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and do you think this sounded anywhere close? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Here's some more playing. But yeah, thanks to Tony for letting me borrow this bad boy. Lovely guitar.